welcome to the Smartest Podcast, where our focus is on creativity, finance, and entrepreneurship. For those of you who are new to the podcast, my name is Melissa Peck. I'm the founder of Smartistry. And what a lot of my guests and I do on these episodes is talk about different factors and components of artist sustainability and empowerment. So that is why I am so honored and delighted to welcome our episode's guest today, Molly W. Schenck. So welcome, Molly. Thanks for being here.
Hello, and thanks for having me, Melissa. I really appreciate this opportunity.
So glad to be with you and so excited to dive in on our topics. So we'll get right to it. I first became aware of your work through your recent essay, Trauma in Theater: Consideration for Arts Leaders as In-Person Theater Returns. And I really am keenly interested in that article. It really sparked a lot in me. How did your research and exploration in that topic begin?
Yeah, um, I'd love to hear more about what it sparked for you as well, but I'll go into kind of this journey that's been about 14, 15 years to get to this point. It started back in undergrad when I was studying theater. And so like 2007, 2008, I got a student worker gig. And part of that student worker job was I had to merge my studies of dance and theater with the mission vision of the office I was working for on campus. And so this was at the University of Maine, and the office was the Safe Campus Project. It was in the Women's Resource Center, and it really focused on sexual violence on college campuses. And I had come across that office like from my own, not that we use this language in 2007, my own Me Too moment. And like I had used that office as a resource and had really supported me through one of my experiences. And so being able to work in that office was something I jumped right in on. And I had no idea what was in store for me. I didn't go in with the thing. I was like, it's a job. They're going to tell me what to do. But then that interview process was like, so how are you going to merge this with theater and dance? And I was like, oh, I'm going to make a theater and dance piece. And so that's how it started. And there's actually a little bit of a write-up of my first experience in inside higher ed, talking about through that rehearsal process. Like I didn't know what I was doing. I was 21 years old. Like I was just like, yeah, sure, I'm going to figure it out as we go. And it was the dress rehearsal of the night before opening night. It was just a one night show, where suddenly like I was livid as a director. Like I felt like no one was on board with me. I felt very alone in the process. And I was just like losing it. And I was like, what is going on? And someone raised their hand and was like, I feel like crap.
You can say it.
And
It's okay.
yeah, that I feel like shit. And I was like, okay. And then like other people started talking about how their dreams had been impacted by the show, how their sleep schedules had changed since being in rehearsals, and just like how it had really become embodied in a unsettling way for them. Um, and then of course, as a director, I was like, oh my goodness, I've like ruined all these humans. So like that was a whole thing. But that's really where the question started, is like, how are we actually doing this work? Because I knew I wasn't the first to do it, even though I couldn't find a lot of research around it. Like, how are we able to embody these things, perform these things, create these things without actually like destroying who we are as human beings? And that's a question that a few years later I revisited when I was getting my master's in higher education. I didn't intend to revisit it, but my grad advisor at the time was like, what about like those skits, that they do at new student orientation? Like maybe you do something about that. And I was like, oh, well, I made this show about sexual violence on college campuses. So that became a whole thing, and did like a whole mixed method approach, and that whole journey of research in academia, really looking at like the parallels between an audience and a creative going through the process. And then in 2016, I revisited it once again with my MFA in dance. And really dug into the qualitative side of the perform experience, to understand what that was, what that is. And that's also when I started my company, Gray Box Collective, as a place to house all of this work. And we continue to make work to this day. That show included was one of them. Yeah, and so I don't think it really was until 2018 that I started identifying this work as the intersection of trauma and creativity, or even saying trauma-informed creative practices. I actually said that as a joke. I was like, it's like we need a trauma-informed creative practices. And then I Googled it and it didn't exist. So it is kind of where I ended up with that. Yeah, and it's this fascinating intersection for me where I feel like so much of what I do and all the like parallel careers and jobs I've had can hang out in one place. Um, so that's how it began and where it's, I guess, currently at in some ways.
Fascinating. I can relate to so much of how you approached your mission. You know, finding a service that you needed or a piece of vocabulary that you needed and having to invent it.
Yeah.
Um, I really appreciate that. And certainly when I read your essay, um, what spoke to me and what was speaking to me at the time was my own difficulty connecting with a flow state and
Mhm.
the ability to write and compose things and focus for periods of time.
Mhm.
And I knew that that was connected to something in me that was a blockage or, um, just a disconnect. So I immediately wanted to dive in on your practice and your research. So let's talk about, your um, the piece where you sort of left off in the dance and the body and movement. And so, what are some of the ways that trauma impacts our body and our physical ability to be creative?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's Bessel van der Kolk who says that trauma is the loss of imagination. I think I should double check that,
Ooh,
but
ouch.
it's right, but like that lands. Um, right. And so okay, like let's go big picture first and talk about like stress and trauma. And kind of just like the general definitions of them or how I like to talk about them, because I know like there's a lot of pathology around trauma, and that is not the lens I use. Like PTSD, that's not what I'm going for. Um, when I'm talking about trauma, I'm also talking about like systemic trauma or institutional trauma, which we can see in our organizations. I'm also taking into consideration like generational trauma, historical trauma, that side of it. So like
Mhm.
it's a big, broad definition that I'm using. And I like to pair it with stress because like they're close. They're real
Yes.
close. You know, and I'm looking at the autonomic nervous system, and I won't like go my full soapbox on the
No,
autonomic
dude.
nervous system. Oh, we do not have time for that. But like in a nutshell, so when we think about these responses, we're thinking about like fight, flight, and freeze. Sometimes fold or fawn is also included in there. Um, and so I think about stress and trauma as things that throw our autonomic nervous system out of whack. And so if like our autonomic nervous systems are GPS, like stress is like, oh, we're like slightly off course and we're able to come back. Where trauma is like we are off course, like we've gone across state lines or something, we're really far away from like that place that we want to be hanging out at. And we can get stuck there is the other thing. So it can
We're
be just
in the
throwing,
lake.
yeah, right. So it can be that like it can be a little bit, but the road of like stress that can accumulate over and over again, eventually we're going to be so far out, um, off of our course, and we can't really easily bring ourselves back into that lane that we wanted to be in. Um, so yeah, so just big picture with stress and trauma, that's the angle I come at this at. Um, and in terms of like the impact on the body and our ability to be creative. So when thinking about the impact on the body, I'm thinking about stored responses that maybe were never completed, or stored responses that at some point served us really well, like it's what helped us survive, but it's not going to work in our current situation, right?
Mhm.
I actually recorded a like micro episode for my podcast on trauma and creativity that's like, cool, like your trauma responses are really valid and they're really wonderful things. Like I think they get a bad rep because we don't really notice them until they get in the way.
Mhm.
However, they're the reason we're still here, like even as a species. So like shout out to trauma responses when they show up when we really want them, right? So just
Yeah.
like reframing that. So yeah, I think about this a lot with like conditioning and more physical theater or dance, especially the stored trauma responses, because we might not even know that they're there. So thinking about the impact on the body, I think I'm going to say mind body, just like let it be the whole thing.
Yes.
Um, so it could be during a conditioning class or warm up activity. We're doing some pushing, or maybe even some like weight sharing activities where we're really pushing into each other. That could be, you know, I have a stored trauma response of a push I never got to complete. And suddenly in rehearsal, I get to push against someone. And that could flood my system and really overwhelm me in that moment. And on the outside, it's like, I asked you to lean into someone, right? But on the inside, it's a completely different experience. I also think about it with, so it's more of like your fight response, right? More of a flight response might be how I'm moving across the stage and I'm being asked to run or move very quickly. And maybe I associate that fast movement with a time that I had to move fast. And so I don't allow myself to really kick up my speed, because that to me will activate nervous system and be like, oh, we're in an unsafe environment again. So there might be some like friction that could show up. A director's like, hey, go faster, go faster, go faster. And I'm trying as hard as I can, but my body won't let me. Because on the other side of that speed, perhaps I'm feeling that that's going to kick me into something I don't want to experience. And those are both more of the active ones. It could also be, I could be asked to be really still on stage, and I associate stillness with being safe because I come from an environment where I needed to constantly be moving in order to stay safe. So there are those things that can show up, and that's more like in the mind body, in the rehearsal space, right? In terms of creativity, and this is kind of I don't know, a key part of trauma informed creative practices, is acknowledging that, and I say this as a human with a history of trauma, and I say this as a human who identifies as very creative. Um, there's a desire to seek predictability, um, and because with that predictability, with those patterns, we know what we're getting into. We can feel safe, both physically and psychologically, in those patterns, as opposed to thinking about, like I think about with like a traditional theater, with your script and your, you know, stage directions and all of that, versus like experimental theater, which is just like, you know, bold and really taking risks and creating things that have never been seen before. And if we're seeking those predictable patterns, experimental theater is going to be, could be overwhelming. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so that could be part of it, but also thinking about what you had said, like just the focus and not being able to like muster that energy. I think that's more like the fatigue or the burnout, that, which I think burnout's a like sneaky trauma, little t trauma. um, that part of it too, of just losing that desire, or losing that ability to focus because we're in survival mode.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. Absolutely. Um, you know, I was thinking in terms of what many of our listeners are interested in, like the entrepreneurial part of the arts business, and the inclination, the balance that we seek between earning a living and producing our creative work, And, you know, artists like myself who have drifted toward a more secure line of income generation, because of past trauma, because of even generational trauma, financial trauma.
Mhm.
Um, so different different sources that are causing that, but it's the same pattern.
Mhm. Mhm.
So you mentioned a moment ago the term sneaky trauma, and there's a couple of terms
Mhm.
um, in your essay that I wanted to just unpack a little bit. So, what do you mean when you write trauma is not an event?
Mhm.
Let's start with that.
Yeah. So I think as a society, we've broadly speaking, accept like these headlining breaking news events as like, oh, that's trauma. A mass shooting, war, like there's no shortage of it at this point, or in our history. So like we identify it as these things that happen outside of our being. And going back, like what I was saying about like it's that response internally of either getting stuck in that state, that survival state, or not being able to complete that state in some way. So it lives in us. It's not outside of us. It's in response to something outside of us, most likely. But unfortunately, that's not where it gets to stay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so the that other term that you mentioned, sneaky trauma, what
Yeah.
is that?
Yeah. So sneaky trauma, it's a subtle trauma. It's the chronic durational trauma. So going back to like our GPS, it's like these little micro movements outside of the direction we want to be going. So subtle, so sneaky that we don't even realize we're off course until suddenly we're like, whoa, that's not where I thought I was going. Like it's, I think it requires a certain amount of distance and time to look back and reflect. Like that was just like subtle ways of adapting and
Mm-hmm.
coping with the world around us. Um, like the pandemic has been a excellent example of this. Just these little tiny adjustments. Well, some of them were massive, but a lot of little adjustments over the past several years, where even like what serves us now didn't serve us 2 years ago, or what served us 2 years ago doesn't serve us now. So it's the little ones. Microaggressions is another one that can be a sneaky trauma that can just kind of add up over time. Irene Lyon uses the visual of like beach balls in a pool. So like it can be like the little beach balls, and you can just keep filling that pool up, and you can hit that tiny beach ball that's going to bounce out of the pool. And it can be a microaggression, but it's still going to bounce out. Doesn't matter what size it is.
Mm-hmm.
The work that I do really handles more that sneaky trauma, that durational trauma, um, the chronic side of it, as opposed to like it's not a crisis response.
Yes.
Yeah.
So can you talk about how what is the process, or how is trauma activated or triggered in our bodies, mind and body, being part of the big picture?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And let's go into like the activated versus triggered, um,
Okay.
and naming that. I know there is a movement, of not using the word triggered at all anymore. I don't want to erase it fully. I don't think that's quite fair to people's lived experiences. And I think it still serves a purpose. I like the activated language because I think it matches the broader definition of trauma that I prefer. Um, where like triggered, if you are having an active flashback in the middle of a scene and you not are not like in the present moment, yeah, you can say you're triggered, like if that makes sense for your lived experience. um but yeah, activated I think is what we see more in a rehearsal space. And activated is the dimmer switch versus like triggered being the light switch. And with an activated response, and those are talking about our nervous system responses, fight, flight, freeze, fold, fawn, etc. Um, Activated allows us to intervene and interrupt a pattern, versus like that triggered is very quick. So we can start to notice in a rehearsal setting, like, you can change, when the vibe changes in the room, right? And so how can you interrupt whatever might be building from a variety of people, or maybe you're working with someone one-on-one. But it's being aware of as soon as that dimmer switch starts to shift, as opposed to um, waiting until someone's fully triggered or 100% activated. Yeah.
That's interesting that you're talking about this in terms of a group setting, like an ensemble type of environment. Um, do you think it's the same in terms of that metaphor of the dimmer switch and the light switch when we're alone experiencing that internal trauma by ourselves?
From my lived experience, I'd say yes. I find it I tend to live in more of that activated dimmer switch response anyways. Um, Versus like when I'm in a more crowded setting, a more ensemble setting. Yeah. But yeah, it's definitely for me, like the activated is something that resonates for me. And I can, like, you can kind of feel that dimmer like rising up from like your guts coming up into like your heart and throat. Like you can feel it. And yeah, that's something, at least from my lived experience, I would say I can experience. Yeah.
I can agree. um so the arena that you are exploring um is a lot to do with the performing arts, a lot of that ensemble setting. So can you maybe share, and I'm throwing you I'm throwing you a curveball here, but can you
Yeah.
maybe share an example of how you've seen that activation occur in a group setting, and what the what the response has been from others that is kind of indicative of how this works?
Mhm. This works being like the trauma informed side of it all, or
Um, Maybe without the trauma informed side. you know, um, what 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 is an example that you have seen or felt in your own lived experience of the activation happening, the room changing, and what has been the response to that?
Mhm. Yeah. I think I'll share an example from a dance rehearsal. So outside of my company rehearsals, um, it's a short one, but there was a day in rehearsal. Someone wasn't present, and that had been addressed already. Um, but it had been brought to light that person also was perhaps not going to be at one of the shows we had. Um, and I could feel that, like, what? Like feeling disrespected, feeling not heard, not seen, like my own trauma responses coming up around that, and just wanting to like lose it so hard in the space, right? Um, and because I could feel it coming up, and I've got my little toolkit that more or less works, I took I had a lot of racing thoughts with it, and I just took a really long breath. And it's been one of my like go-to responses when I feel myself getting activated in a rehearsal space. I'll say, that's new information for me. And it's just like long, and you can tell everyone else's like eyes are on you, right? Of like, how's she gonna respond to this? And so like just create a little bit of space of being able to say, like, yeah, that's new information. And we can finish talking about it at the end of rehearsal. Um, so for me, like as long as I can create some space in some way, I'm usually able to navigate surprising things that happen. I'm not a fan of surprises. I like my structure. So that's one of the things. But even like running an organization, like that entrepreneurial side of having to, like, it is a collective, and I mean that in the greatest sense, that like there's a ripple effect for everything someone does or doesn't do. And so with the pandemic and the fatigue of all of, one of my other go-tos has been um, something like acknowledging a behavior, like, hey, I see you haven't been responding to emails, right? Like very factual. And then instead of coming at it with like, I need you to respond to this, it is what's getting in the way and how can we work through that?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, not taking behavior as like you're perceiving it, like getting really curious about it.
Yes.
And that's what served me very well. And all of those responses are like my back pocket ones that sound a little bit like a broken record sometimes, but at least like it creates a little bit of space for me, so I'm not constantly in like a response kind of a thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Gosh, you have me thinking about Brene Brown and vulnerability
Mm-hmm.
and the language that I've used in cases like that is to say, can I check something out with you? You
Nice.
know, can
Yeah.
I, yeah, because I'm feeling this way. Was it your intention? Or,
Yeah.
asking those questions, or even was there a reason why you didn't answer my email?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
that's a great way to approach it.
Yeah. Well, and I realized like that's some of the language I also use that I didn't bring up, like getting to a space where we can be responsive instead of reactive, because the reactive kind of hangs out with that trigger thing. Like it's a reaction, it is happening, there is no stopping it. Where response, like it's a little bit more dynamic. We can have a little like wiggle room and go with the flow, perhaps, just like a little. So yeah, like really thinking about like how can I create space and time or response instead of reaction.
Hmm. So, one of the things that I wanted to dive in with you on,
Mhm.
um, you know, is the way that trauma by by impacting our creativity
Mhm.
has ultimately um, another impact on our financial sustainability as artists.
Mhm.
And um, I just wanted to kind of get your feeling on that. Do you see that in your own lived experience? Have you come across that? I know that I have, but I'm curious to know your take on it.
Yeah, definitely experiencing it currently in my personal life. And like prior, like about a year ago, I was in year 10 of a career in higher ed, and absolutely burnt out from teaching. And since I was an adjunct for that time, I was also working in fitness centers. And so at any given point, I think I had, I don't know, maybe a dozen contracts going at a time. Um, and like that in of itself can be a trauma response. It can be that scarcity mindset of like there isn't enough, and that like I have to keep working and I'll never make enough money. And like that that can, when you got to pay the bills, um, that's gonna come up. But I literally work myself, like I'm physically and mentally burnt out, um, like having to quit all of those jobs that I had lined up, and completely like reorganize my life, so that I was able to like interrupt some of those responses that were happening. And I think when like you talk about a little bit like work life balance, and we'll get to that, but um when part of your work is like being creative and it's something that you just love to throw yourself into, it's hard to say no, which can be a people pleasing response. Like it all just cycles back on itself. And So I think it's really about the sustainability of like the gigging lifestyle right now and working ourselves to burn out mentally, physically, which can be that sneaky, subtle trauma. And like, where's that cycle stop of you gotta survive, um, pay the bills, and if you have an injury, especially for more physical forms, or it doesn't even have to be that physical, like that can really force you to interrupt the cycle.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think it's a nasty little cycle. And when we look at capitalism and white supremacy, like they're all systems of oppression. So that's all going to perpetuate more trauma. Um, so it's really hard to like carve out a space as a creative. I think that allows you to actually be in more of a space that's healing. Um, yeah, it's messy.
Yes, just when we need it the most, that space to be creative and
Mhm.
to heal. Um, it is the balancing has become a job in and of itself. And I'm just glad that, you know, these systems of oppression and you know, burnout power dynamics
Mhm.
are being more openly questioned, more openly challenged. And I feel that a lot of the creative work that many of us will be doing will be focused on shifting that balance. Um, and so that makes me angry because what if I wanted to make art about dolphins right now? Instead, I have to use my activation powers for taking down the man. So,
Well, and I don't know if this is something that you've experienced, but I'm starting to kind of connect some dots where I feel like there's a shift around here where people are more interested in independent creativity as opposed to ensemble based creativity. Um, and I'm saying that strictly based on like a few conversations I had and a few emails that have floated through my inbox that have seemed like independent artists or like artists flying solo seem to be just like busting at the seams. Like that's where everyone's hanging out. Where opposed to that, and naming that I've been talking a lot of binaries, they're all continuums. I live in the gray, I promise. Like the more ensemble collaborative work seems to be, I don't know, quieter, or less in demand right now. And I feel like there's got to be some connection to the pandemic with that shift.
there must be because it's simple proximity and challenges of technology to allow us to use the same modalities that we were used to in those group settings.
Mhm.
Um, I think that has to be a part of it. So we're talking about groups and we were talking about the differences between the individuals and groups. Your essay in particular speaks to the experience of the individual who's dealing with trauma, but you do go on later to talk about how trauma functions within a group or an organizational setting. So, can you talk a little bit more about the ways that organizations and arts organizations, maybe specifically, encounter trauma?
Mhm. Yeah, I think some of it also ties back into what you were saying around power as well. Um, but I do wonder if encounter feels like it's more the individuals. I think about organizations more as perpetuating or reinforcing or
Love it.
rewarding trauma
Interesting.
responses. Um, and acknowledging like their individuals in the organization, all of that. Um, yeah, I've been thinking about like how, especially like with Gray Box Collective and like not really changing anything that we do, because I think we're on the right path, but starting to build some more of the vocabulary around it and being able to name it. But I'm thinking about like what are we doing that might be perpetuating a traumatic response, or reinforcing it, rewarding it? How can we interrupt that? I think about this a lot with our education system in the US.
Oh, sure.
Um, right? Like the like perfect attendance award or whatever. Like Yeah, so we are teaching people to hide however they might be feeling in order to, get all A's, and like our straight A's actually like perfection kind of thing of like actually showing academic potential. Like, no, it's not. We know that. Um, and I think about this a lot in like the ballet world
Mhm.
of this perfectionism and this achievement and always striving more. And I don't feel like there's an acknowledgement like, yes, you can strive and be ambitious and want all of that, and can we also be really happy with where we are right now? um like it's always future focus, which can be anxiety provoking, as opposed to being in the present moment and being really content with where we are right now. um I also think there's a certain level of binary thinking that comes with that. That either or thinking can also be a trauma response. We can start to collapse information as a way to save space in our brains. Um, and I think there are several, I think the shape that a lot of art forms take can really perpetuate that. So as organizations, are we holding space for those kinds of art forms? Are we holding spaces where there's some other counterculture option? I think about hustle culture, right?
Oh,
Like,
yes.
and the one upmanship of like how little I slept last night. Like, no, sleep, y'all. Like, it's right. Um, and like making choices around that. But I think that's where organizations can really be supportive, right? And one of the things that I really try to do is like, I don't, the business term of like the lowest, what is it, most viable product or
Oh,
something.
yeah, minimum viable product,
That,
or in corporate speak, the low-hanging fruit.
sure. um I think about it like that way, like how many hours do we need to spend together to create a performance? How many hours would I like to spend together to create a performance? Very different number. um but when the funding is sparse, um, I'm going to make some choices around like, all right, minimum amount of hours, like our performance this round, 12 hours of rehearsal, done. Because that's all that I felt the funding in this area supported.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, and I think the last thing, I'll kind of meandered with this one, but I think I open a paragraph of that essay with this, like an organization is only as healthy as the people at top. um, which, yes, we're moving away from hierarchical power hoarding structures, and there's still going to be someone or someones that said like, hey, we're going to do this thing, right? So the health of an organization is really based on the health, like whole being health, of those saying, hey, we're going to do this thing. um, yeah, all
S-
over the place with that.
I there's a lot there, and it's understood. So how how can arts or theater organizations become more trauma informed?
Mhm. Yeah, it's a journey. It's not a destination. I'll say that first. And I do think, as is in the article, like you start with yourself. Um, there's a meme that went out about like, before you decolonize your classroom, you have to decolonize yourself. And like I hold that same sentiment to the trauma informed work. You got to do some internal work. You got to do some like tough conversations with yourself before you're really able to start to put like structures in place. Um, I think it's also about knowing your audience, your artists, the people you work with. Um, Chances are, the if I even like list it out, here's XYZ of what I do, and like you try to copy and paste it into your organization, it probably won't work. Um, like I hope it could inspire something, but it's not a one size fits all. Um, if there was like one shift to make, it's creating space in each rehearsal for nervous systems to do what nervous systems need to do. And so as taken in rehearsals, whether it's in a dance setting or with Gray Box Collective, that can be like, all right, 1 minute of doing absolutely nothing. Um, cool, 1 minute. And like, that's kind of our like least thing we'll do. Um, just to still hold that as a value and make sure that that's something that we're always creating space for and we keep that habit. And then it can also be more physical. It could be more meditative. It can take what shape it needs to, but being sure to build that into the rehearsal structure is really important.
That's cool. I think about, you know, hopefully it's the standard and not the exception these days to have an intimacy coordinator on a show along with, fight or violence design coordinators. um, it would be really cool to have a trauma informed practice coordinator, to guide that. Is that something that you already are doing?
Um, not quite in that context, but that would be like my jam. Yeah, totally. Um, and even just like one of the other hats I wear is a somatic movement therapist. So like when I see bodies in space, I'm noticing how they're moving through space and what might be carried in them, which which can add a whole nother layer to all of the things.
I would like to take you through the artist hot seat questions with the last few minutes that we have. But before we start that, um, tell us, the Gray Box Collective's mission, active projects, that sort of realm.
So, with Gray Box Collective, we are an interdisciplinary, experimental, post dramatic, trauma informed arts organization that devises original performances around social and emotional well being, which is to say that we make weird art about tough stuff. With that, we hang out in the messy gray area of life, and we have a series going on right now called Play in the Gray, where it's a 40-minute virtual like creativity improv jam is how I'm referring to it. That's led by 5 different teaching artists who've been with Gray Box Collective, like some since before we were Gray Box Collective, and some that joined post or mid pandemic. And kind of coming up, we have a podcast already, and season one's out there. And what we'll be doing over the summer is recording season two that will focus on one-on-one conversations with the other artists who were part of our last season. And that devising process was like hybrid because we had in person as well as digital. And we're going to be continuing that. We have an online store where you can, for the rest of the month of April, and we can extend it as well for listeners if that's something you're interested in. We have a virtual performance. So we have the archival version of our performance that premiered in January, which includes as well like some behind the scenes stuff and like kind of our creative process in action, as well as, so we had a prologue and an epilogue film that were a part of that. So you can get all of that in our online store, along with some of our postcard performances, and like follow us on social media and all of that to see like the other little pop-ups that are happening over the summer, including some workshops on trauma and creativity.
Incredible. I love how many different disciplines and approaches that you're taking to this. So cool.
Yeah.
Um, so let's go into our hot seat if you are game for it.
Ready.
The objective here is to be quick and short, so don't feel like you have to um, say any more than you want to. Okay. Um, so the first question is, how would you characterize your current relationship with money, and has it always been that way?
Yeah, so I've definitely been thinking more about with Gray Box Collective how money flows through the organization. And that's a huge shift of like redistributing wealth and yeah, just allowing like that energy to flow through the org. Like the whole point of making money is to give it to other people anyways right now. So yeah.
If you were to describe your financial habits, how would you characterize them?
Evolving. Um, and within Gray Box Collective more specifically, like there are certain values I hold on to, like 80 to 90% of every year's budget is staying with local businesses, local artists. It's not going to like buy stuff. We're paying people for their work and services.
What's your biggest area of financial lifestyle struggle?
I think I struggle most with like finding advice that really works for me. I think a lot of the advice out there works well for your 9 to 5 or, you know, I don't know, normal journey, where it doesn't really work for freelancers or artists or creatives.
I'm working on that.
Okay, thank
Working
you.
on
Yeah.
that.
More of it.
Are you or have you been able to support yourself or your household financially with your creative work?
Sort of. So, like, yes, and to that, of kind of like my creative work and arts adjacent work of like teaching art or teaching dance or teaching fitness. So, yes, and
Okay. What's your vision of a perfect work-life balance for your future? And what do you think it would take you to get there?
so I don't believe in perfect. And like I'm currently enjoying the work-life balance I have, and been very intentional about building that work-life balance and then adjusting it when I either have the capacity to or when I really want to. So I'm living it. I'm not waiting for it.
I love that. What's the most valuable lesson you've learned about personal finance in your career?
Trust the process. Like there's like a bizarre, unwavering faith that I've been living right now with it. So yeah, we'll see how much longer that lasts.
All right, here's the speed round. This
Ready.
is like a word association.
Mhm.
What's your experience been with savings?
Okay, it's got me through tough times.
Debt?
I am a millennial. Yes, I have it.
Health insurance?
Awful, horrible experiences.
Life insurance?
Fear mongering.
Financial planners?
No experience.
That's the end of our hot seat.
Cool.
So, what I wanted to ask you is just what's next for you personally, and what can we look for your next steps?
Yeah. So some of the stuff that I already mentioned for Gray Box Collective and like follow us on social media for seeing more of what we do. And we are keeping the virtual thing going. And I'm really hoping to do a pretty like massive call for artists and creatives like all over the world for our next project. So that'll be out eventually, like in the next few months. So follow that. And then more of my work is with the trauma and creativity side of it. Um, I do have a course coming out for trauma informed teaching for dance educators with human kinetics that launches May 10th. So that'll be available. And as I mentioned, I'm doing some more workshops on trauma and creativity this summer, as well as like diving in more on the somatic side of it and the somatic movement therapy and education. So people can definitely check out my website. I've got newsletters on my personal website as well as Gray Box Collective, and signing up for those would be the easiest way to let the information come to you.
Awesome. And we will put both of your websites in the description for this episode. So our
Thank
listeners
you.
can find them here, there, here, there.
Yeah.
And Molly W. Schenck, thank you so much for your time and the great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.